It was a bright Monday morning when Margaret Hayes pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Westfield Music Academy. She carried an old leather bag that had seen better days, the kind that looked like it had traveled through decades of life. Her floral dress was simple, nothing fancy, just something comfortable that she'd probably picked up from a regular store. At 52 years old, she had gentle gray streaks running through her hair, which she kept tied back in a neat bun. The academy itself was impressive. Grand hallways with high ceilings, walls decorated with portraits of famous musicians, and the faint sound of piano melodies drifting from practice rooms. This was where the city's best music teachers worked, where students paid thousands to learn from the finest instructors. Margaret made her way to the faculty lounge, following the signs down the polished corridors. When she entered, about 7 or 8 teachers were already there, gathered around the coffee station. They were dressed so differently from her. Designer blazers, expensive watches, perfectly styled hair. They looked like they belonged in a fashion magazine, not a music school. She stood at the doorway for a moment, clutching her bag. Nobody turned to greet her. They were too busy discussing something about an upcoming performance, laughing at inside jokes, speaking in that confident way people do when they're comfortable in their world. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat softly. A young woman with sleek black hair glanced over, her eyes quickly scanning Margaret from head to toe. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it said everything. It was the kind of look that sized someone up and dismissed them just as fast. "Can we help you?" the woman asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I'm Margaret Hayes. I was hired as the temporary accompanist," Margaret replied, her voice gentle and steady. "Oh, right. The replacement," another teacher said, barely looking up from his phone. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with that casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Margaret noticed the shift in the room. It was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders relaxed, interest faded. She wasn't someone important, just a temporary fill-in, someone to play background music while the real artist did their work. She found an empty chair near the corner and sat down, placing her worn bag beside her. The conversation resumed as if she wasn't there. They talked about complex musical theories, dropped names of composers and techniques, debating things like proper interpretation of Beethoven's later works and the best way to teach advanced harmonics. Margaret listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Every now and then someone would glance her way and she could almost read their thoughts. Who is this woman? Does she even understand what we're talking about? Why did they hire someone so ordinary? One teacher, a woman with red lipstick and an elegant silk scarf, leaned toward her colleague and whispered something. They both looked at Margaret and smiled, not the friendly kind of smile, but the kind that comes with judgment. Through the window, Margaret could see students walking across the courtyard, carrying instrument cases, chatting excitedly. She remembered being that young once, full of dreams and possibilities. Life had been so different then. "So, Margaret," the tall teacher finally addressed her. "Have you worked at music academies before?" "I've played piano most of my life," she answered simply. "That's nice," he replied in that tone people use when they're being polite but not really interested. "Well, the job is pretty straightforward. You'll accompany practice sessions, maybe help with some beginner classes. Nothing too complicated," Margaret nodded. "I'm happy to help wherever needed." "Great," he said, already turning back to his friends. The head of the piano department walked in then. Dr. Hoffman was his name. A man in his 60s with silver hair and an impressive reputation. He'd studied in Vienna, performed across Europe, and taught some students who'd gone on to win international competitions. Everyone straightened up a bit when he entered. "Good morning, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying authority. His eyes swept the room and landed on Margaret. "Ah, you must be our new accompanist." "Yes, sir." "Margaret Hayes," he nodded briefly. "Welcome to Westfield. I trust you'll do fine with the basic requirements." The way he said basic made it clear he didn't expect much from her. As the morning went on, Margaret was given a tour of the facilities. The practice rooms, the concert hall, the music library. The person showing her around was nice enough, but kept the explanations simple, as if Margaret might not understand anything too technical. By lunchtime, Margaret found herself alone in the cafeteria. The other teachers sat together at a large table near the window, their laughter and animated conversations filling that corner of the room. She didn't try to join them. She could sense she wasn't really part of their circle. Not yet, maybe not ever. She ate her simple sandwich and watched them. These were accomplished people, no doubt. They'd worked hard to get where they were. But somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten something important. They'd forgotten that talent doesn't always come wrapped in expensive clothes. That genius doesn't need to announce itself. As Margaret finished her lunch, she walked past the main concert hall. The door was slightly open. Inside, a beautiful grand piano sat on the stage, its black surface gleaming under the soft lights. Her fingers tingled. It had been a while since she'd played on a stage like that. She glanced around. Nobody was watching. Slowly, she walked down the aisle and climbed the steps to the stage. Her hand reached out and gently touched the piano's surface. Cool and smooth, perfect. She didn't sit down. Not yet. That moment would come. For now, she just stood there, remembering who she used to be and who she still was, underneath all the years and grief and quiet living. Behind her, she heard footsteps and quickly stepped away from the piano. A janitor entered with a mop and bucket. Beautiful, isn't it? The janitor said, nodding toward the piano. Yes, Margaret replied softly. Very beautiful. She left the concert hall and headed back to her small office, just a tiny room with a desk and a computer. On the wall there was a poster of Mozart. She smiled at it like greeting an old friend. This was her life now. Simple, quiet, underestimated. But inside, where it mattered, the music still lived, and music, real music, never dies. It just waits for the right moment to remind everyone what true beauty sounds like. The next day brought the official welcome meeting for all faculty members. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, wanting to make a good impression. The conference room was elegant, with a long mahogany table and leather chairs. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. She chose a seat near the middle, not too prominent, not too hidden. As other teachers filtered in, they filled the seats around the table, but somehow the chairs on either side of Margaret remained empty. It wasn't that anyone told others not to sit there. It just happened naturally, the way these things do. The music director, a stern woman named Victoria Chen, called the meeting to order. She went through various administrative matters, upcoming events, new policies. Then she got to introductions. We have a new temporary staff member joining us. Margaret Hayes will be serving as our accompanist while Daniel recovers from his surgery. Margaret, would you like to stand and say a few words? Margaret stood, feeling all eyes on her. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to working with all of you. If anyone needs accompaniment for practice or performances, please don't hesitate to ask. She sat back down. There was polite applause, the kind that's more about courtesy than genuine welcome. Dr. Hoffman leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. Margaret, have you worked with advanced students before? Our students here are quite exceptional. They're preparing for prestigious competitions and university auditions. I understand, Margaret replied. I'll do my best to support them. Well, Dr. Hoffman continued, his tone carrying a hint of condescension, perhaps you might benefit from observing some of our master classes first, to get a feel for the level we maintain here. We wouldn't want any mishaps during important practice sessions. A few teachers chuckled. Margaret noticed a younger instructor actually covering her mouth to hide a smile. Of course, Margaret said calmly. I'm happy to observe. Excellent, Dr. Hoffman said, clearly pleased with himself. It's always good when people know their limitations. The meeting continued, but Margaret felt the subtle shift in how she was being perceived. She wasn't just new. She was lesser, an outsider who probably couldn't keep up with their standards. During the coffee break, Margaret stood by the refreshment table, preparing a simple cup of tea. A group of 3 teachers stood nearby, not quite whispering, but not speaking loudly either. Did you see her shoes? One said. I think my grandmother has the same pair. Be nice, another replied, though she was smiling. Maybe she's very talented. Talent doesn't require designer clothes. True, but have you noticed her hands? They look so rough. Real pianists take care of their hands like surgeons. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. Her hands were rough. Years of washing dishes, cleaning, taking care of her children after her husband died. Life hadn't given her the luxury of hand creams and weekly manicures. She walked back to her seat, passing their group. They immediately changed the subject, suddenly very interested in discussing weekend plans. The afternoon brought Margaret's first real task. She was to accompany a violin student during practice. The student, a 16-year-old girl named Lily, seemed nice enough. But her teacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, watched Margaret with obvious skepticism. "We're working on Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto," he informed her, handing over the sheet music. "It's quite demanding. The piano part requires precise timing and dynamic control. Do you think you can handle it?" Margaret looked at the music. She knew this piece. She'd performed it at Carnegie Hall when she was 14. But she simply nodded. "I'll do my best," they began. Margaret played carefully, professionally, matching Lily's tempo and dynamics. She didn't show off, didn't add unnecessary flourishes, just provided solid, reliable accompaniment. When they finished, the teacher nodded, surprised. "Well, that was adequate. We'll see how you do with more complex pieces." Adequate. The word stung more than outright criticism would have. Lunchtime came again, and again Margaret sat alone. She'd brought food from home, nothing fancy, just a simple meal in a plastic container. Across the room, the other teachers dined on salads from the expensive cafe down the street, discussing their summer vacation plans in Europe. One teacher, a woman who taught vocal performance, caught Margaret's eye and smiled. For a moment, Margaret thought she might come over. But then Dr. Hoffman called her name and she turned away, drawn back into the inner circle. Margaret understood. She wasn't being intentionally excluded. She just didn't fit. She didn't have the right clothes, the right background, the right presence. To them, she was temporary help, not a colleague. As days passed, the pattern continued. Margaret handled her duties quietly. She made coffee in the faculty lounge, organized sheet music in the library, answered emails about scheduling, tasks that had nothing to do with her actual musical abilities. One afternoon, she was in the music library, filing away old scores, when two young teachers came in. They didn't notice her behind the tall shelf. "Can you believe they hired her?" one said. "I mean, I'm sure she's a nice person, but this is Westfield Academy. We have standards." Victoria said they couldn't find anyone else on short notice. Daniel's surgery was unexpected. Still, at the faculty showcase next month, we'll have to make sure she's just handling backstage stuff. Can you imagine if she actually had to perform? How embarrassing. They both laughed and left the library. Margaret stood frozen behind the shelf, holding a stack of Brahms scores. Her hands trembled slightly, not from anger but from something deeper, a quiet sadness that comes from being invisible to people who should know better. That evening, after everyone had left, Margaret found herself alone in the building. The janitor had finished cleaning and gone home. Security was minimal, just someone at the front desk. She walked to the main concert hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Inside, the grand piano waited in darkness. She turned on just one small light above the stage and sat at the bench. Her fingers touched the keys and she began to play. Softly at first, a simple melody. Then gradually she let herself go. A Chopin nocturne flowed from her fingers, filled with all the emotion she'd been holding back. The sadness of being dismissed, the memory of who she used to be, the love of music that had never died. The piano sang under her hands. Each note perfect, each phrase filled with decades of understanding. In this moment, alone in the darkness, she wasn't an ordinary woman in a floral dress. She was an artist, a master, someone who had once made audiences weep with beauty. When she finished, she sat quietly, her hands still resting on the keys. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Soon," she whispered to the piano. "Soon they'll understand." She stood, turned off the light, and walked out into the night. Tomorrow she would return to being invisible, underestimated, overlooked. But deep inside, where music lives, she remained who she'd always been. And nothing could ever change that. By the end of the first week, Margaret had settled into a routine that had very little to do with actual music. Every morning, she arrived early to prepare the faculty lounge. Coffee brewing, cups arranged, sugar packets refilled, small tasks that someone needed to do, and somehow, everyone assumed that someone was her. She didn't complain. Complaining wasn't in her nature. Her mother had taught her that dignity meant doing whatever work came your way with grace. So she brewed the coffee and smiled when teachers thanked her absently, already buried in their phones or conversations. "Oh, Margaret, while you're up, could you grab me a napkin?" Became a common request. "Margaret, the copier is jammed again. Could you take a look?" "Margaret, someone left a mess in practice room 3. Would you mind?" She became the person who fixed things, found things, cleaned things. the invisible helper who kept everything running smoothly, while the real musicians focused on important work. On Thursday morning, a notice went up on the bulletin board. The annual faculty showcase was scheduled for 3 weeks away. It was a big event where teachers demonstrated their skills for students, parents, and local music critics, a chance to show why Westfield Academy deserved its prestigious reputation. Margaret read the notice carefully. A performance list would be posted soon. Each teacher would have 10 minutes to perform a piece of their choosing. In the faculty lounge, excitement buzzed. Teachers discussed what they would perform, debating between crowd pleasers and technically challenging pieces that would impress the critics. Dr. Hoffman held court at the center table, surrounded by admirers. "I'm thinking Rachmaninoff," he announced. "The Piano Concerto No. 2, third movement. Difficult, yes, but nothing worth doing is easy." Everyone nodded appreciatively. Dr. Hoffman was known for his technical precision, though some whispered that his playing lacked soul. "But nobody said that out loud. What about you, Margaret?" someone asked. The question surprised everyone, including the person who asked it. There was an awkward moment of silence. Dr. Hoffman laughed, not cruelly but dismissively. "Oh, I think Margaret will be quite busy helping with backstage preparations. Someone needs to make sure the piano is properly positioned, the lighting is correct, programs are printed. Very important work." "Yes, exactly," Margaret agreed quietly. "Whatever helps the show run smoothly. See? She understands her role perfectly," Dr. Hoffman said, patting her shoulder in a way that felt patronizing. "That's the mark of a good team member, knowing where you fit." Later, when the performance schedule was posted, Margaret's name appeared exactly once. Margaret Hayes, stage coordination and piano maintenance. Piano maintenance. As if she were a technician, not a musician. A young teacher named Rachel, who taught clarinet, noticed Margaret reading the schedule. Rachel was one of the kinder ones, perhaps because she was newer and hadn't fully absorbed the Academy's culture of superiority. "It must be frustrating," Rachel said quietly. "Not being able to perform," Margaret smiled. "I'm just happy to be useful." "But you're a pianist. Don't you miss performing?" "Performing isn't everything," Margaret replied. "Sometimes the greatest music happens when nobody's watching." Rachel looked confused but smiled politely and walked away. That afternoon, Dr. Hoffman decided to give Margaret a lesson in proper piano care. He gathered several faculty members in the concert hall where the grand piano sat waiting. "Margaret, come here," he called, like summoning a student. "Since you'll be responsible for the piano during the showcase, let me show you the proper way to maintain it." Margaret walked to the stage, aware of everyone watching. "First," Dr. Hoffman said, running his hand along the piano's edge, "you must dust carefully. This instrument is worth more than most cars. Use only soft cloths, never spray anything directly on the surface." Margaret nodded, though she probably knew more about piano care than anyone in the room. "The keys," he continued, "require special attention. You'll notice some teachers leave fingerprints or sweat. These must be cleaned gently." He demonstrated with exaggerated care, as if showing a child how to tie shoes. Some teachers watched with amusement. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And finally, Dr. Hoffman concluded, "You must ensure the bench height is correct before each performance. Different pianists have different preferences. Can you remember all that?" "Yes, sir," Margaret said simply. "Good. We're trusting you with a significant responsibility." He patted the piano like it was a beloved pet, then walked off the stage, clearly pleased with his demonstration. Margaret stood alone at the piano. Her hand rested on the smooth surface. Beneath her fingers, she could feel the instrument's potential, the thousands of sounds it could make, the emotions it could express. This piano had probably been played by many talented musicians, but she wondered if any of them truly understood it the way she did. "Don't worry," she whispered to the piano when everyone had left. "I know who you really are." The following days brought more of the same treatment. Margaret became the Academy's unofficial problem solver. Scheduling conflicts? Ask Margaret. Missing sheet music? Margaret will find it. Need someone to cover a class at the last minute because a teacher was running late? Margaret can sit with the students. She did it all without complaint, watching as teachers rushed past her, focused on their own importance. She saw their talent, recognized their dedication, but also noticed their blindness. They'd become so focused on status and reputation, that they'd forgotten why music mattered in the first place. One evening, a student stayed late practicing in one of the smaller rooms. Margaret was doing some filing nearby when she heard wrong notes, then frustrated sighs, then the sound of someone crying. She knocked gently on the door. "Are you all right?" A girl of about 17 looked up, tears on her cheeks. "I can't get this passage right. My teacher says if I don't master it by next week, I'm not ready for the competition." "May I see?" Margaret asked. The girl showed her the music. It was a Beethoven sonata, a particularly challenging section that required both technical skill and emotional understanding. "Can I show you something?" Margaret asked gently. The girl nodded. Margaret sat at the piano and played the problematic passage, not just correctly but beautifully. Her fingers moved with effortless grace, showing the girl exactly how the notes should flow, how the emotion should build. The girl's eyes widened. That was perfect. How did you do that?" "The secret," Margaret said softly, "isn't just in playing the right notes. It's in understanding what the composer felt when he wrote them. Beethoven was fighting against fate, against loss. This passage isn't about speed. It's about determination." She played it again, this time emphasizing the emotional arc. "Try it now," Margaret encouraged. The girl played, and this time it was better. Not perfect, but genuinely better. "Thank you," the girl said, wiping her tears. "You're really good." "Why don't you teach here?" Margaret smiled. "I do teach, just not officially." As she left the practice room, she didn't notice Dr. Hoffman standing in the hallway, having heard everything. His expression was unreadable as he watched her walk away. The night of the faculty showcase arrived with all the excitement and nervousness that comes with any major performance. Margaret arrived 3 hours early as requested. The concert hall needed to be perfect, and somehow, that responsibility had fallen entirely on her shoulders. She checked every light, adjusted the stage curtains, arranged programs on every seat, and tested the piano multiple times to ensure it was in perfect tune. The instrument responded beautifully to her touch during those test runs, almost as if it knew something special was about to happen. The backstage area buzzed with energy as teachers arrived. They wore elegant concert attire, black dresses and tuxedos, looking every bit the professional musicians they were. Margaret wore the same floral dress she'd worn on her first day with a simple cardigan. Nobody had told her she'd need anything fancier, and even if they had, she couldn't afford it. "Margaret, could you steam this dress?" "There's a wrinkle," one teacher asked, thrusting the garment at her. "Margaret, I need water, room temperature, no ice," another demanded. "Has anyone seen my sheet music?" "Margaret, can you check the music library?" She moved through the chaos like a quiet stream, solving problems, calming nerves, making sure everyone had what they needed. Nobody thanked her. They were too focused on their own performances. The auditorium filled quickly. Parents proud of their children's teachers. Students excited to see their instructors perform. Local music critics with notebooks ready. The mayor even showed up sitting in the third row. This was a big night for Westfield Academy's reputation. Victoria Chen, the music director, gave Margaret last-minute instructions. "Stay backstage. If anything goes wrong with the piano, you'll need to fix it quickly between performances. Keep the water pitcher filled. Make sure performers get on stage on time. Think you can handle all that?" "Yes, I can do that," Margaret assured her. The show began beautifully. The first teacher, a violin instructor, performed a Mozart piece that had the audience smiling. Then came a vocal performance, passionate and powerful. Each act was strong, professional, exactly what people expected from Westfield Academy. Backstage, Margaret watched from the wings, seeing the joy on each performer's face as they received applause. She remembered that feeling. Standing on a stage, sharing music with an audience, feeling that electric connection when art truly communicates. It had been so long. Dr. Hoffman was scheduled to perform near the middle of the program. He'd been rehearsing his Rachmaninoff piece for weeks, mentioning it at every opportunity. "The concerto is quite demanding," he'd said multiple times. "Only a true master should attempt it." As the performance before his ended, Dr. Hoffman stood in the wings, doing last-minute stretches, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers. Margaret noticed he looked tense, more nervous than she'd expected. "5 minutes, Dr. Hoffman," the stage manager whispered. He nodded, took a deep breath, and then suddenly, his face twisted in pain. He grabbed his lower back and let out a sharp gasp. Are you okay? Margaret asked, moving closer. My back, he groaned, bending forward. It's seizing up. It happens sometimes when I'm stressed, but not like this. Not now, Victoria rushed over. What's wrong? Muscle spasm, Dr. Hoffman managed to say through gritted teeth. Severe, I can't perform. Panic spread through the backstage area like wildfire. This was the showcase piece, the performance everyone was waiting for. Dr. Hoffman was their star, their reputation maker. Without him, there would be a huge gap in the program. Can someone else play something? Victoria asked desperately, looking around at the assembled teachers. Everyone looked at each other. Some had already performed. Others were vocalists or string players without prepared piano pieces. Those who played piano weren't prepared to perform such difficult material without practice. I could play my piece twice, one teacher suggested weakly. That's not acceptable, Victoria said, running her hand through her hair. We need something impressive. Something that shows our caliber. The critics are here. The mayor is here. We can't have an empty slot. Time was ticking. The audience was beginning to murmur, wondering about the delay. Victoria's eyes swept the backstage area desperately and landed on Margaret, who stood quietly in the corner, holding a pitcher of water. For a moment, their eyes met. Victoria's expression showed her thoughts clearly. This is absurd. But what choice do I have? Margaret, Victoria said slowly. Can you play? Anything at all? We just need to fill the time. Every person backstage turned to look at Margaret. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed barely concealed amusement. The quiet woman in the floral dress playing on the big stage in front of all these important people. Dr. Hoffman, still bent over in pain, looked up. You can't be serious. Do we have any other choice? Victoria snapped, then turned back to Margaret. Well, can you play something? Anything? Margaret stood very still. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment, if she'd imagined it at all. She'd been content to remain in the background, to let others shine. But music has its own timing, its own destiny. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I can play. Thank God, Victoria breathed. Just play something simple, something safe. We just need to fill 10 minutes. Margaret nodded and began walking toward the stage entrance. Behind her, she heard whispers. This is going to be a disaster. Should we warn the audience? Poor woman. She's going to embarrass herself. The stage manager looked at Margaret with pity. Are you sure about this? It's a big audience, Margaret smiled gently. I'm sure. As she walked onto the stage, the bright lights hit her face. The auditorium stretched before her, hundreds of faces looking at her with confusion. This wasn't the famous Dr. Hoffman they'd been waiting for. This was just some woman in a simple dress. The murmuring grew louder. People leaned toward each other, asking questions. Who is that? Where's Dr. Hoffman? Is she even a teacher? Margaret walked steadily to the piano and sat down. The bench was at the perfect height. She'd made sure of that herself. She adjusted her position slightly, placed her hands gently on her lap, and closed her eyes. In that moment, everything else disappeared. The confusion in the audience, the skeptical faces backstage, the years of being overlooked and underestimated. All of it melted away. There was only Margaret and the piano, two old friends about to speak to each other in the language they both understood best. She opened her eyes, lifted her hands, and positioned them over the keys. Her fingers hovered there for just a heartbeat. Then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu in C-sharp minor filled the concert hall. Not hesitantly, not carefully, but with absolute confidence and breathtaking power. The murmuring stopped instantly. Every single person in the auditorium froze, unable to believe what they were hearing. Backstage, Dr. Hoffman straightened up despite his pain, his eyes wide with shock. The music flowed from Margaret's fingers like water, like light, like pure emotion given sound. This wasn't just good playing. This was something else entirely. This was magic. Margaret's fingers moved across the piano keys with a speed that seemed impossible. The Fantaisie Impromptu is one of Chopin's most challenging pieces, famous for defeating even skilled pianists. It requires the right hand and left hand to play in completely different rhythms simultaneously, creating a cascade of notes that sounds like a waterfall of music. But Margaret played it as if it were as natural as breathing. Her hands flew across the keyboard, the notes tumbling out in perfect precision. The left hand laid down a steady rolling rhythm while the right hand danced above it, creating melodies that soared and dipped like birds in flight. Every note was crystal clear, yet they all blended together into something larger than the sum of their parts. In the audience, people sat frozen, mouths slightly open, eyes wide. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody dared to breathe too loudly and disturb what they were witnessing. A mother who had come to support her daughter's cello teacher found tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. The music was touching something deep inside her, something she'd forgotten was there. The mayor, who had attended out of political obligation and planned to leave at intermission, leaned forward in his seat completely captivated. The music critics, who had come with their usual skeptical attitudes, stopped taking notes. Their pens hovered uselessly over their notebooks. This wasn't something you could capture in words. Backstage, the transformation in the teachers was even more dramatic. The smirks and amused glances had vanished completely. Every person stood in absolute stillness, staring at the wings of the stage where they could partially see Margaret. Rachel, the young clarinet teacher, had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." Dr. Hoffman stood completely still, his back pain forgotten. His face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Victoria Chen gripped the edge of a table, her knuckles white. She looked like someone who'd just watched their entire understanding of reality crumble. On stage, Margaret seemed to have entered another world. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the music. But it wasn't performance for show. This was genuine emotion, pure connection with the music. She wasn't playing the piano. She was speaking through it, telling a story that had no words but communicated everything. The piece moved through its different sections, the famous rapid opening theme, where notes cascaded like rainfall. Then the slower middle section, heartbreakingly beautiful, where the melody sang with such sweetness that several people in the audience found themselves crying without knowing why. Margaret's face showed everything she was feeling. Years of joy and sorrow, love and loss all pouring out through her fingers into the music. This wasn't just technical mastery, though the technique was flawless. This was art in its purest form, a human soul expressing itself in the only language that truly transcends all barriers. A teenage student who'd been forced to attend by his parents sat up straighter. He'd been planning to play games on his phone the whole time. Now his phone lay forgotten in his lap. Something was happening to him. Something he didn't understand. The music was showing him that beauty existed in the world, real beauty, not the fake, manufactured kind he was used to. An elderly gentleman in the back row closed his eyes and was transported back 60 years to the first time he'd heard this piece, played by a master pianist in Vienna. He'd fallen in love with classical music that night. He'd thought he'd never hear playing like that again. But here it was, in this small city, in this school auditorium, played by a woman nobody had even noticed before. The music built toward its famous climax. Margaret's hands moved faster and faster, the notes coming so rapidly they almost seemed to blur together, but each one was perfect, each one precisely placed. Her years of practice, decades of living with music all came together in this moment. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breath came faster. The physical demand of the piece was enormous, but she never faltered. She had played this piece hundreds of times in her life. She knew every note, every phrase, every emotional beat, and tonight, she was playing it better than she ever had before. Maybe it was the years of silence, all those nights playing alone in the dark. Maybe it was the pain of being dismissed and overlooked. Maybe it was the pure joy of finally being able to share her gift again. Whatever it was, the music that came from that piano was transcendent. Backstage, one of the teachers who had mocked Margaret just days before slid down to sit on the floor, her legs unable to support her. She stared at nothing, her mind trying to process what was happening. "That's the woman we had making coffee?" someone whispered in disbelief. "That's the woman we had cleaning practice rooms," another added. "That's the woman we treated like a maid," a third voice said, thick with shame. The piece moved toward its ending, the rapid notes gradually slowing, the emotion resolving. Margaret played the final phrases with such tenderness, such understanding, that it felt like saying goodbye to someone you loved. The last few notes hung in the air, soft, perfect, final. Margaret played the very last note and let it ring out, her foot on the sustain pedal, letting the sound fade naturally into silence. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her eyes remained closed for a moment, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The auditorium was completely silent. Not a single person moved. 3 seconds passed. 4. 5. Then, like a dam breaking, the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People leapt to their feet. Shouts of "Bravo!" filled the hall. The sound was like thunder, like waves crashing, like joy made audible. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. She looked out at the standing audience, at their faces full of wonder and appreciation. She stood slowly, her legs a bit unsteady, and bowed. The applause grew even louder. She straightened and looked at the piano, placing one hand gently on its surface. A small gesture, a quiet thank you to the instrument that had helped her speak. Then she bowed once more and began to walk off stage. Backstage was chaos. Teachers stood in stunned groups, some crying, some just staring. As Margaret stepped off the stage, they all turned to look at her. She walked past them quietly, heading toward the back exit. She needed air. She needed a moment alone, but she couldn't escape. Victoria Chen blocked her path, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else. Something that looked like fear. "Who are you?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you, really?" Margaret looked at her with kind, tired eyes. "I'm just Margaret Hayes, same as I was yesterday." "No," Victoria said, shaking her head. "Nobody plays like that unless they're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say what she was thinking. Because what she was thinking seemed impossible. Dr. Hoffman pushed through the crowd, his phone in his hand. His fingers were shaking as he typed something into the search bar. His face grew paler with every second as he read what appeared on the screen. "Margaret Hayes," he said slowly, looking up from his phone. "Margaret Elizabeth Hayes." He turned the phone around, showing the screen to Victoria. On it was an old article from a classical music magazine. The headline read, "Child prodigy Margaret Hayes stuns Carnegie Hall." The photo showed a young girl, maybe 12 years old, sitting at a piano, her face serious and focused. "That's you," Dr. Hoffman whispered, looking at Margaret. "You're that Margaret Hayes." Victoria grabbed Dr. Hoffman's phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the article. Her eyes darted across the screen, reading faster and faster, her expression changing from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror. "Carnegie Hall at age 12, she read aloud, her voice shaking. "Studied in Moscow under Vladimir Ashkenazy. Won the International Tchaikovsky competition at 19. She looked up at Margaret, then back at the phone. "This says you were called the greatest pianist of your generation." Other teachers crowded around, trying to see the phone. Someone else had pulled out their device and was searching frantically. More articles appeared, photos from different decades, concert programs, reviews from world-famous music critics. "She performed with the London Symphony Orchestra," someone read from their phone. "There's a recording of her playing Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto when she was 20. The critics called it definitive. She was invited to perform at the White House. Look at this. She studied at Juilliard on a full scholarship when she was just 16. Each new piece of information fell like a hammer blow. The teachers stood in a growing circle around Margaret, their faces showing everything they were feeling. Shock, embarrassment, shame, awe. Rachel was crying openly now. "We had you making coffee, we had you, oh God, what did we do?" Dr. Hoffman's face had gone from pale to gray. He looked like he might be sick. His hands hung at his sides uselessly as he stared at Margaret, remembering every condescending word he'd said to her, every dismissive gesture. "You let me lecture you about piano care," he said, his voice barely audible. "I showed you how to dust a piano. I treated you like you didn't know, like you were." He couldn't finish. The weight of his own arrogance had hit him fully. Victoria was scrolling through more articles. "It says here you disappeared from the public eye 30 years ago, after your husband." She stopped reading, looking up at Margaret with new understanding. "You stopped performing after he died?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Thomas was killed in a car accident. I had 2 small children. They needed a mother, not a famous pianist who was always traveling, so I chose them. I chose a quiet life. But the music, someone whispered. How did you just walk away from all that? I didn't walk away from music, Margaret said gently. I just walked away from fame. There's a difference. I played every day for my children. I played in my living room, at church, at small community events. Music doesn't need an audience to be real. More teachers were gathering now, word having spread through the backstage area. Everyone wanted to see the woman they'd been dismissing for weeks, the woman who turned out to be a legend. A young teacher who had mocked Margaret's shoes just days before stood at the edge of the group, tears running down his face. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Victoria put a hand to her forehead, looking dizzy. We need to tell the audience. They need to know who you are. This is incredible. This is the biggest thing that's ever happened at this academy. No, Margaret said firmly. Please don't. But why? Victoria asked, genuinely confused. You're Margaret Hayes. You're a living legend. People need to know. They just heard the music, Margaret replied. That's all that matters. The music speaks for itself. It doesn't need my biography attached to it. Dr. Hoffman stepped forward, and for the first time, Margaret saw real humility in his face. I need to apologize. Not just for tonight, but for everything. The way I spoke to you, the way I treated you. His voice cracked. I've dedicated my whole life to music, and I forgot the most important thing. I forgot humility. I forgot that genius doesn't announce itself. He held out his hand. Margaret looked at it for a moment, then took it. His handshake was gentle, almost reverent. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you for reminding me what real artistry looks like. In the auditorium, the audience was still buzzing with excitement. People stood in groups talking animatedly about what they'd just witnessed. The music critics were having intense discussions, using words like miraculous and once in a lifetime. One critic, a woman who'd reviewed concerts for 30 years, stood alone by the window, looking out at the night. She'd seen all the great pianists of her time. She'd heard performances in Vienna, New York, London, Tokyo. But what she'd just witnessed in this small school auditorium was something different. It was pure, unfiltered artistic truth. She pulled out her phone and began typing a review, but stopped after a few words. How do you describe the feeling of witnessing perfection? How do you capture in language that moment when you realize you're in the presence of greatness? Backstage, more teachers were apologizing, their words tumbling over each other. Margaret listened to each one, accepting their apologies with grace. She understood their shock. She understood their shame. She'd never wanted this attention, but if it taught them something important, then maybe it was worth it. Rachel pushed through the crowd and hugged Margaret, not caring about professional propriety. You're my hero, she said, her voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. Not because you're famous, but because you stayed true to the music even when no one was watching. Margaret hugged her back. That's the only way to live with art, she said softly. You don't do it for applause. You do it because you have to, because it's part of who you are. The stage manager appeared, looking flustered. The audience is asking for an encore. They're not leaving. They want more. Everyone looked at Margaret. She sighed, a small smile playing at her lips. I suppose one more piece wouldn't hurt. The crowd parted as she walked back toward the stage. This time, the teachers watched her with different eyes. They saw the way she carried herself, the quiet, confidence that had always been there, but they'd been too blind to notice. They saw the slight calluses on her fingers from decades of practice. They saw the depth in her eyes, the accumulation of years spent in service to something greater than herself. As Margaret walked back onto the stage, the audience erupted again. People were calling out requests: Chopin, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. So many voices, so much enthusiasm. Margaret stood at the piano and held up her hand gently. The crowd quieted. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but carrying through the hall. I'd like to play one more piece for you. A simple one. Something that reminds us why we love music in the first place. She sat down and began to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. Not the dramatic third movement that everyone knows, but the gentle, contemplative first movement. The piece that sounds like moonlight on water, like memory, like love. It was the piece she'd played at Thomas's funeral. The piece she'd played for her children when they couldn't sleep. The piece that had carried her through the hardest years of her life. As the music filled the hall, something magical happened. People stopped thinking about technique or fame or reputation. They just listened. They let the music wash over them, let it speak to their hearts. This was what Margaret had always understood and what others often forgot. Music isn't about showing off, it's not about proving you're the best. It's about connection. It's about touching something true in the human experience and sharing it with others. When the last note faded, there was that same profound silence. Then applause, but different this time. Quieter, more reverent. The kind of applause that says, "Thank you for this gift." Margaret stood and bowed deeply. Then she walked off stage for the second time, and this time, when she reached the backstage area, she found something she hadn't expected. Every teacher, every staff member, every person who worked at the academy was standing in two lines, creating a path. As Margaret walked between them, they began to applaud. Slowly at first, then building. Not the wild applause of an audience, but something more personal. The applause of colleagues, of people who recognized they'd been in the presence of a master and had been too foolish to see it. Margaret walked through them, her eyes shining with unshed tears, touching a hand here, nodding there, accepting there, respect in their apologies with the same grace she'd shown throughout everything. At the end of the line stood Dr. Hoffman. He bowed to her, a deep formal bow of genuine respect. Margaret stopped and touched his shoulder gently. "Get your back checked," she said kindly. "A good musician needs to take care of their body." He laughed, a sound mixed with tears. Yes, I will." As Margaret finally made her way to the quiet of the back hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment, allowing herself to feel everything. The joy of playing, the pain of remembering, the satisfaction of finally being seen. The relief that she could return to quiet Margaret tomorrow, because that's who she really was. Not the famous prodigy, not the legend. Just Margaret Hayes, who loved music more than fame, and who had just reminded everyone at Westfield Academy what it means to be truly great. By the time Margaret made it to the small office that had been assigned to her, word had spread throughout the entire building like wildfire. Students who had remained after the performance were pulling up videos on their phones, old recordings of Margaret from decades ago. They huddled in groups, watching in amazement, then looking toward the backstage area with new understanding. "That's the lady who helped me with my scales last week," one student whispered in disbelief. "She found my lost sheet music," another said. "I thought she was just like the cleaning staff or something." The shame in their voices was real. Even the young people who'd barely noticed Margaret before were beginning to understand what had happened here. In her office, Margaret sat in the simple chair and let out a long breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from nerves but from the sheer physical and emotional output of the performance. She hadn't played like that in front of an audience in 30 years. Her body remembered, but it had been an effort. There was a gentle knock on the door. She looked up to see Victoria standing there, no longer the confident music director, but a woman who looked shaken to her core. "May I come in?" Victoria asked. Margaret nodded, gesturing to the only other chair in the tiny room. Victoria sat down and was quiet for a long moment, seemingly struggling to find words. Finally she spoke. "I've been the director here for 15 years. I thought I knew talent when I saw it. I thought I understood music, understood musicians." She looked at Margaret with red-rimmed eyes. "But I judged you based on your clothes, your age, the way you spoke so softly. I assumed quiet meant ordinary. I was so wrong." "You weren't wrong to judge," Margaret said gently. "You were wrong about what matters. But we all make that mistake sometimes." "You're being too kind," Victoria said, shaking her head. "I don't deserve kindness. Do you know what I did? I actually considered not hiring you. Your resume just said you had extensive piano experience. No degree listed from a fancy school. No famous teachers mentioned. I almost threw it away. Margaret smiled slightly. My resume was honest. I do have extensive piano experience, but why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you mention Juilliard, the competitions, the concerts? Because those things are in the past, Margaret replied. They're not who I am now. I'm a mother, a grandmother. I'm someone who plays piano for the joy of it. That's all I wanted to be here. Victoria looked down at her hands. The critics are already posting reviews online. One of them called your performance the most extraordinary piano playing she's heard in her entire career. Another said it was a reminder that true genius doesn't fade, it only waits. They're being generous, Margaret said. No, they're being accurate. Victoria looked up, her expression serious. Margaret, I need to ask you something. Will you stay? Will you teach here? Not as an accompanist. As a proper teacher. We'll give you your own studio, your own students, whatever you need. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said honestly. I took this job because I needed something simple, something that didn't come with expectations or pressure. I'm not sure I want to return to that world. But think of what you could teach, Victoria pressed. Not just technique, but what music really means. What it really is. That's something our students desperately need to learn. That I desperately need to learn. Before Margaret could respond, there was another knock. This time it was Dr. Hoffman, looking smaller somehow, as if the evening had physically diminished him. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said. Margaret, I wondered if I could speak with you privately. Victoria stood up. Of course. I'll leave you two alone. She paused at the door. Please think about what I said, Margaret. We need you here. When she was gone, Dr. Hoffman sat down heavily in the chair she'd vacated. He looked at Margaret for a long moment, and she could see he was struggling with something. I've been teaching for 40 years, he finally said. 40 years. I've trained students who've gone on to prestigious careers. I've performed on stages around the world. I've recorded albums. I thought I'd accomplished something meaningful. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But tonight, watching you play, I realized something. I've been teaching people to play notes. You taught that entire audience what music really is. That's not true, Margaret said softly. You're an excellent teacher. No, he said firmly. I'm a good technician. There's a difference. I can teach someone to play all the right notes in all the right order. But what you did tonight, that connection to something deeper, that ability to make people feel something true, that's not something I know how to teach, because I'm not sure I know how to do it myself anymore. He pulled out his phone and showed her something. It was an old video, grainy and poor quality, from what looked like the 1990s. A young Margaret, maybe 25 years old, playing in a concert hall somewhere in Europe. I was there, Dr. Hoffman said quietly. At this concert. I was a student then, studying in Vienna. I went to hear you play Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. I'd never heard anything like it. I went home that night and practiced for 8 hours straight, wanting to play like you, wanting to make music like you did. He put the phone away. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what inspired me. I got caught up in reputation and status and proving I was better than everyone else. I became exactly the kind of musician I used to despise. And tonight, when you walked onto that stage in your simple dress, looking so ordinary, I thought. He couldn't finish. Overcome with shame. You thought I didn't belong there, Margaret finished for him. Yes, he whispered, and I was so wrong. You're the only one who truly belonged on that stage tonight. Margaret reached over and took his hand, a gesture that surprised him. We all lose our way sometimes. The important thing is finding our way back. How do I find my way back? He asked, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. How do I become the kind of musician I used to dream of being? You start by remembering why you fell in love with music in the first place, Margaret said. Not the applause. Not the recognition. The music itself. The way it makes you feel. The way it connects you to something larger than yourself. They sat in silence for a moment, two musicians separated by a lifetime of different choices, but connected by the same fundamental truth. Will you help me? Dr. Hoffman asked. I know I have no right to ask after how I treated you. But will you teach me? Not piano technique. I know that. But the other thing, the thing that makes music matter, Margaret smiled. I think we can teach each other. You know things I've forgotten too. I've been away from the professional world for so long. Maybe we both need to learn again. There was another knock at the door. This time it was Rachel, the young clarinet teacher. along with several other faculty members. They crowded into the tiny office, some standing, some sitting on the floor. "We wanted to know if the rumors are true," Rachel said. "Did you really study with Vladimir Ashkenazy?" Margaret nodded. "For 3 years in Moscow. He was a demanding teacher, but incredibly kind." "And you performed at Carnegie Hall when you were 12? Another teacher asked. 13, actually. My birthday was the week before." The questions came one after another. About competitions she'd won, orchestras she'd performed with, conductors she'd worked under. Margaret answered each one simply, without boasting, treating these incredible achievements as if they were ordinary events. "Why did you stop?" Someone finally asked the question they'd all been wondering. "You were at the peak of your career. You could have been one of the greatest pianists in history. Why walk away?" Margaret looked at all the eager young faces surrounding her. "Because I had something more important to do," she said. "I had children who needed their mother, and I realized that being the greatest pianist in the world meant nothing if I lost the people I loved most." "But the music," Rachel protested. "Didn't you miss it terribly?" "I never left the music," Margaret replied. "I just changed how I related to it. I played for my children. I played at their school concerts. I played at church. I played for myself. Music doesn't need a grand stage to be meaningful. Some of the most beautiful music I've ever made was in my living room, with my children sitting on the floor listening." An older teacher who'd been quiet until now spoke up. "That's what we've all forgotten, isn't it? We've made music about achievement instead of about beauty, about winning instead of about feeling." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but it's never too late to remember." As the group finally dispersed, leaving Margaret alone again, she looked around her tiny office. Tomorrow everything would be different. Tomorrow people would treat her with respect, maybe even reverence. They would want her wisdom, her guidance, her name attached to their academy. But Margaret hoped that what they'd really learned tonight wasn't about her past accomplishments. She hoped they'd learned that real greatness comes in many forms, that talent doesn't need to announce itself, that the most profound music often comes from the quietest places. She picked up her worn leather bag and prepared to leave. As she walked through the now empty hallways, she could still hear echoes of the applause, still feel the piano keys beneath her fingers. But what mattered most to her was something else. It was the look on that young student's face when Margaret had helped her with her Beethoven. The morning after the showcase, Margaret woke up in her small apartment like she always did. The same alarm clock. The same view of the sunrise through her bedroom window. The same routine of making coffee and toast. For a moment, she could almost pretend that last night had been a dream. But her phone told a different story. 63 missed calls. Over 200 text messages. Her email inbox had exploded with messages from people she hadn't heard from in decades. Former colleagues. Music journalists. Concert promoters. Even her old agency. Asking if she'd consider coming out of retirement for a performance tour. Margaret turned off her phone and finished her breakfast in peace. When she arrived at the academy, everything had changed. Students who'd walked past her for weeks now stopped and stared. Some asked for autographs. Others just wanted to shake her hand or thank her for the performance. "You inspired me to practice harder," one young pianist told her, his eyes shining. "You showed me what's possible," another said. Margaret smiled at each of them but gently reminded them, "What you saw last night was just one moment. The real work happens in all the quiet moments nobody sees. Don't forget that." In the faculty lounge, the transformation was even more dramatic. Teachers who dismissed her now couldn't meet her eyes. Others were overly friendly, trying to make up for their previous behavior. Someone had already made fresh coffee for her, and a comfortable chair had been moved to a better spot, as if someone had decided she deserved it. But the most surprising change was in Dr. Hoffman. He arrived early and asked if he could speak with Margaret before the day began. They walked together to the main concert hall, empty now in the morning light. "I couldn't sleep last night," he admitted. "I kept thinking about what you said, about remembering why I fell in love with music." He sat down at the piano but didn't play, just rested his hands on his knees. "I realized I couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, music became about proving myself, about being better than others. I forgot the feeling I had when I was young, when hearing a beautiful piece would make me cry." "It's not gone," Margaret assured him. "It's just buried. You can find it again. Will you help me?" he asked, And this time there was no pride in his voice, just honest need. Of course, Margaret said, but first you need to do something for me. Anything. Stop trying to be the best, she said gently. Start trying to be honest. When you play, don't think about impressing anyone. Just think about what the music means to you. What it makes you feel. He nodded slowly. That sounds terrifying. It is, Margaret agreed with a small smile. Being vulnerable always is, but that's where real art lives. In the vulnerable places. Over the next few weeks, word of Margaret's performance spread beyond the academy. The local news picked up the story. Hidden Genius Discovered at Music School read one headline. The greatest pianist you've never heard of, said another. A national magazine wanted to do a feature story. A documentary filmmaker reached out. Several concert halls offered her prestigious performance slots. The offers kept coming. Each one more impressive than the last. Margaret declined them all politely. But why? Victoria asked, genuinely confused. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You could return to the stage. You could have the recognition you deserve. I already have what I deserve, Margaret replied. A quiet life. Work that matters. Time to think and feel and be present. But the world needs to hear you play, Victoria protested. The world heard me play, Margaret said. That one night. Maybe that's enough. Maybe sometimes one perfect moment is better than chasing after many imperfect ones. She did agree to one thing, though. She accepted a permanent teaching position at the academy. Not as an accompanist, but as a proper instructor. But she insisted on certain conditions. Small class sizes, no pressure to produce competition winners, freedom to teach music as art, not as sport. Her first group of students was small, just 5 young pianists who'd specifically requested to study with her. On the first day, they sat nervously in the studio, waiting to hear from the legend, the genius, the woman who'd stunned everyone with her incredible talent. Margaret looked at them and smiled. Before we talk about piano technique or practice schedules, I want to ask you a question. Why do you play music? The students exchanged glances. One brave girl spoke up. To get better? To win competitions? Those are goals, Margaret said. But why music? Why not chess or tennis or mathematics? What is it about music specifically that calls to you? They thought about it. Really thought about it. Finally, a quiet boy in the back raised his hand. When I play, I feel like I'm saying things I don't have words for. Like the piano understands me when nobody else does. Margaret's face lit up. Yes, that's exactly it. That's what we're going to explore together. Not how to play faster or louder or more technically perfect, but how to say true things with music. How to be honest at the piano. Her teaching style was unlike anything the students had experienced. She spent as much time talking about life, emotion, and human experience as she did discussing technique. She asked them to write about what they felt when they played certain pieces. She had them listen to recordings and describe the emotions they heard. Music theory is important, she told them. Technique is essential, but they're just tools. What matters is what you're trying to express. A hammer is useless if you don't know what you're trying to build. Dr. Hoffman sometimes sat in on her classes, taking notes like a student. His own playing began to change. It became less precise but more moving, less perfect but more human. His advanced students noticed the difference. You're playing differently, one told him after a lesson. I'm trying to play more honestly, he replied. It's better, the student said. It makes me feel something. The academy itself began to transform. The competitive atmosphere softened slightly. Teachers started sharing more, helping each other more, judging each other less. Not completely human nature being what it is. But the presence of someone like Margaret, who'd achieved everything and chose simplicity, reminded them all of what truly mattered. Rachel, the young clarinet teacher, became one of Margaret's closest friends at the academy. They often had lunch together, talking about music and life and everything in between. Do you ever regret it? Rachel asked one day. Giving up fame? You could have been one of the greatest pianists in history. Instead, most people never even heard of you. Margaret thought about it. I was one of the greatest pianists. For a while. But then I became something better. I became a good mother, a present parent, someone who was there for the people who needed me most. She smiled. And you know what? I made more beautiful music in my living room playing for my children than I ever made in any concert hall. Because the people listening really mattered to me. But don't you miss the applause? The recognition? Sometimes, Margaret admitted. I'm human. But I learned something important. Applause is wonderful, but it fades. It has to fade. If you live for applause, you're always chasing it, always needing more. But if you live for the music itself, for the truth it expresses, then you're satisfied every time you play, even if nobody's listening. Months passed. The story of Margaret's performance became a legend at the academy. New students heard about it from older ones. Teachers used it as an example in their lessons, though they often missed the point, focusing on Margaret's hidden talent rather than her humility. One afternoon, Margaret was leaving the academy when she noticed a woman standing by the entrance. She was dressed simply, carrying a worn violin case, looking uncertain. She couldn't have been more than 30. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked. The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm a music teacher at the community center across town. I heard about what happened here. About you. I wanted to see if it was true. If someone like you really exists, like me, someone who chose music over fame, who chose to stay quiet instead of chasing glory." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I've been struggling. I love teaching kids at the community center, but everyone tells me I'm wasting my talent, that I should be pursuing a real career, performing, making a name for myself. But I love what I do. I love those kids. I just needed to know if it was okay to choose this life." Margaret smiled and touched the woman's arm gently. "It's more than okay. It's noble. Teaching children to love music is one of the most important jobs in the world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The woman wiped her eyes. "Thank you. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that." As Margaret watched her walk away, she thought about all the people out there, doing important work in quiet ways. Teachers, parents, community volunteers. People who chose meaning over recognition. People who understood that greatness isn't about being seen. It's about being true. That night, alone in her apartment, Margaret sat at her old upright piano. It was nothing like the grand piano at the academy. Some keys stuck slightly. The tuning wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and it had seen her through the hardest years of her life. She played for no one but herself. A simple Brahms intermezzo, tender and introspective. She played it not to impress, not to prove anything, but simply because it was beautiful and she wanted to share a moment with it. When she finished, she sat in the silence, her hands resting on the keys. She thought about her journey,